One moment, the woods are calm. A campfire crackles, gear shifts, and a guide scans the trail. Then comes the bear. Massive, silent, and unstoppable. Grizzlies and polar bears don't bluff. They charge, tear, and vanish just as quickly. Some victims never had a chance. Others fought with everything they had to survive. These aren't just close calls. They're raw, violent collisions with nature's fiercest predators. In this video, we cover 6 terrifying real-life encounters, from a 2025 RV park attack to a cameraman who vanished in the wilderness without a sound. On the far eastern edge of Russia, just west of the Amur River and bordering China, lies a small outpost known more for its logging roads and quiet pine woods than for anything remarkable. Blagoveshchensk had always been a sleepy border town. Still, by the summer of 2025, several RV parks and weekend retreats had popped up just outside its outskirts, attracting local retirees and road-tripping families eager for affordable wilderness. The Sirovaya Creek RV Park, positioned between the thinning forest and a dusty regional road, had been operating unofficially for nearly 2 years. It was run by a local named Pavel Rudolph, who offered long-term slots to anyone needing peace or cheap space. There was no fence, no official ranger oversight, and no bear-proof trash management system. Just a rusted dumpster, often left open, with leftover meat, fish bones, and half-burned barbecue scraps. In the early morning of June 10th, at approximately 2:03 a.m., a massive and underfed Russian grizzly entered the camp. The bear had reportedly been spotted along the tree line several days prior, rummaging near dumpsters and walking boldly into cleared spaces, but those sightings had gone unreported. Locals had assumed the bear would move on or be scared away by human activity. That assumption turned out to be disastrously wrong. According to later accounts, the bear first approached the RV park's eastern edge, where a Birobidzhan family had left 2 coolers outside overnight. It smashed one open, consumed everything inside, and then moved toward the center of the camp, now following the scent trail of food and grease. The attack began near a modest camper owned by Mikhail and Raisa Toporov, a retired couple visiting from Khabarovsk. The bear reportedly flipped their trailer onto its side with such force that the undercarriage snapped, scattering aluminum and plastic across the site. Both Toporovs were inside at the time and were severely injured. Raisa suffered broken ribs and deep lacerations to her arms, while Mikhail sustained a fractured pelvis trying to shield her. When others in the camp awoke to the noise, the grizzly had already torn into 2 more campsites. A 10-year-old boy named Igor Filatov, who had been sleeping in a tent with his older sister, was dragged several meters before being let go. His screams likely startled the bear into releasing him. He sustained deep bite wounds to his leg and shoulder, but survived. The chaos intensified when the bear moved toward a smaller pop-up camper where a man named Vasily Krut was alone. Krut, a former forest ranger in his 60s, had parked his truck nearby and kept an old bolt-action rifle under the driver's seat while others screamed and scrambled. Krut ran barefoot across gravel and broken beer bottles to reach his truck. The animal, now fully enraged and swiping at tents like foliage, closed in on a woman trying to climb atop her picnic table. Witnesses later recalled that she slipped just as the bear lunged, and it tore into her back with its claws. Nearby, a man in his late 40s tried to distract the bear by shouting and throwing a cooler. It turned on him next, knocking him to the ground with a brutal swipe that broke his ribs and left him unconscious. Krut fired the first shot just as the bear stood upright and roared. The shot hit the bear in the shoulder, causing it to stumble sideways. The second shot, clean and precise, struck the animal just beneath the jaw. It dropped where it stood. The entire attack lasted under 15 minutes, but the damage was staggering. 5 people had been mauled, 3 trailers destroyed, and nearly every tent shredded beyond repair. Emergency responders arrived roughly 30 minutes later, after multiple calls to local dispatch overwhelmed their primitive radio system. Investigators from the Wildlife Bureau arrived later that morning and identified the bear as a large male, approximately 14 years old, weighing nearly 600 kilograms. Its stomach contents included plastic wrappers, cooked meat, and charred bone fragments. The bear was underweight for its age, with patchy fur and signs of old wounds, likely a result of territorial fights or injuries from steel traps. Officials confirmed loggers had seen the same bear on the northern slope 3 days prior. At the time, it had shown no aggression and was assumed to be passing through. The public reaction was swift and visceral. Residents demanded to know why no alerts had been issued, while environmentalists pointed to worsening habitat loss due to illegal logging operations. Satellite imagery later showed that over 300 hectares of forest had been stripped within 10 kilometers of the RV park in the preceding year, displacing wildlife deeper into human zones. Conservationists argued that the bear's behavior wasn't rogue, but desperate. The mayor of Blagoveshchensk ordered an immediate audit of unregulated campgrounds. At the same time, the Ministry of Natural Resources was forced to issue a national statement acknowledging the spike in human-predator conflicts in the Russian Far East. The event sparked debate nationwide about rural safety, conservation policy, and the slow dismantling of Russia's wilderness buffer zones. Of the 5 victims, all survived, though 2 were hospitalized for over a month. Raisa Toporov later gave an interview in which she refused to step into the woods without a whistle and pepper spray. The boy, Igor, returned to school by fall and was later seen proudly wearing a plastic cast signed by nearly every student in his class. As for Vasily Krut, the man who stopped the bear, he refused accolades. When reporters tried to contact him for a feature, he declined, saying only through a neighbor that he just did what he was trained to do. Those who knew him said he kept the bear's bullet-pierced skull mounted above his garage, not out of pride, but as a reminder. The RV park was shut down permanently 2 weeks later. The land now sits overgrown with waist-high weeds and rusting trailer shells. Locals sometimes joke that the forest took it back. Others don't joke at all. Kodiak Island, situated in the Gulf of Alaska, and known for its remote wilderness, jagged coastline, and one of Earth's densest populations of brown bears, has always drawn naturalists and thrill-seekers alike. It's where seasoned outdoors people went not just to photograph nature, but to confront it. The bears here were unlike any others, larger, more aggressive, more unpredictable. The island was raw, wet, and merciless. But to men like Leif Brennan, it was paradise. Leif Brennan had been documenting wildlife for over 15 years. Originally from northern Michigan, he'd built a modest reputation in wildlife videography for getting unusually close footage of dangerous predators: wolves in Mongolia, jaguars in Brazil, and polar bears off Nunavut. By 2013, he'd taken a deep interest in Alaska's coastal brown bears and had returned to Kodiak for his 4th trip. He planned to spend 2 weeks alone near the Karluk River this time. Capturing the grizzlies during peak salmon run, he'd chosen late August specifically for the light and behavior patterns. Bears were hyper-focused on feeding and could be filmed from a safe distance if unprovoked. He had permits, a satellite phone, and gear packed into waterproof cases. According to journal entries and emails, his plan was simple: hike upstream, find a bank with strong camera angles, and set up a blind where he could work undisturbed. The area he entered was only accessible by float plane and had no established trails or ranger presence. That isolation was intentional. Brennan was methodical and not reckless, and his last known communication with a colleague noted that he had scoped out several ideal spots for his tripod and camera traps. He was alone, but confident. 4 days passed without contact, which wasn't immediately alarming. Satellite reception in the dense alder-covered valleys could be patchy, but by the 5th day, his check-in window passed without a signal. The pilot who had flown him in, a bushman named Owen Trask, became concerned and reported Brennan as overdue. Search teams were mobilized quickly due to the potential dangers involved: hypothermia, injury, or worse. A day later, a search party discovered his camp mostly intact. His sleeping bag and food containers were undisturbed, but roughly 300 meters away, they found his tripod lying sideways by the stream bank, one leg broken and splashed with mud. His satellite phone had been smashed against a rock. Torn pieces of clothing and a bent pair of eyeglasses lay nearby. His waterproof field journal, scrawled with notes about light angles and bear movement, was found soaking in the stream. He had written on one of the last legible pages, "Big male circling. Heard a brush move behind the blind, too fast to track." There was no body, but nearby claw marks on a tree trunk and deep impressions in the mossy earth suggested a large bear had charged through. It was surmised that Brennan had attempted to film too close to the stream's edge, likely hidden in an improvised blind of branches. A bear had either caught his scent or seen him move and reacted instinctively. Weeks later, a wildlife officer conducting a river survey recovered his camera several kilometers downstream. The memory card, miraculously intact, held the final sequence. Experts and investigators viewed the footage in silence. The last minutes showed the steady approach of a large male bear emerging from alder thickets. The bear paused, sniffed the air, and then, without warning, charged the camera directly. The image shook violently, then went black. The footage circulated quietly among wildlife circles. The attack itself wasn't what disturbed professionals, it was the timing. Brennan had done everything correctly. He'd been downwind, out of sight, and had a clean vantage. The bear, it appeared, had simply stumbled into his presence by chance and acted with primal speed. There was no provocation, no error, just an instant in which instincts clashed. The official report classified Brennan as presumed deceased due to wildlife encounter. No physical remains were recovered. Later, a small memorial plaque was installed at a museum in Kodiak, where his work had once been showcased. Friends and colleagues described him as meticulous, humble, and deeply aware of the risks. The incident sent ripples through the wildlife documentary community. Veteran field workers began revisiting their protocols. Training courses began to include Brennan's case as a teaching module, not as an example of foolish risk-taking, but as a sobering reminder that even the most experienced could be caught off guard. What haunted many was that Brennan hadn't been a thrill-seeker chasing fame. He'd gone quiet, alone, with a genuine respect for the animals he filmed. His journal reflected not arrogance, but awe. He had written about the bears as living monuments of a vanishing world, creatures deserving reverence, not conquest. Local rangers increased signage and awareness campaigns for solo travelers. Permits for remote regions began to include stricter check-in requirements, and more guided services were recommended. But Brennan's disappearance remained a dark entry in Kodiak's long record of human-bear encounters. His sister, Carmen Brennan, later published a small book compiling his photographs and notes from previous expeditions. In the introduction, she wrote that Leif had never considered himself brave, only lucky to have spent so much time in nature's rawest places. She didn't frame his death as a tragedy, but as a final expression of a life spent trying to see the world as it truly was: wild, indifferent, and beautiful. As for the bear, no specific individual was ever identified or captured. The valley where Brennan vanished remains untouched, patrolled only by time and silence. Locals say the bears still come to the river in late August, drawn by instinct, just like he was. In winter 2018, southwest Montana saw one of its most unstable snow seasons in over a decade. Unseasonal warming cycles, followed by sudden cold snaps, left fragile snowpacks hanging dangerously across backcountry ridgelines. Avalanche warnings came often, and most experienced skiers either stayed on marked runs or delayed their ventures entirely. But Marcus Halverson, 32, wasn't like most skiers. A self-taught survivalist and backcountry enthusiast originally from Boise, Idaho, Marcus had spent nearly every winter of the last 6 years exploring remote routes across Montana's mountain corridors. He wasn't reckless. He used a GPS beacon, carried avalanche gear, and checked forecasts meticulously. But he believed in precision over fear, and on February 12th, he made a solo ascent into the Gallatin Range to traverse a narrow gulch north of Hyalite Peak. He documented his planned route in a notebook left behind in his Subaru. It was a risky trail, threading beneath a steep corniced face known to locals as Dead Tooth Ridge. Avalanche conditions that week had been rated considerable, a category that typically warns of slab instability and poor bonding in the snow layers. The weather shifted rapidly that afternoon. What began as a clear blue sky morning turned into an overcast churn of wind and fine snow by mid-afternoon. Marcus had likely reached the ridgeline around 3 p.m., judging by GPS pings later extracted from his tracking beacon. From there, he descended into the gulch's shadowed bowl, where the snow, thinner and wind-swept above, gave way to deep powder, a trap disguised as beauty. According to search and rescue reports, the slide happened around 3:45 p.m. A sudden drop in temperature caused surface layers to contract and crack, releasing a slab roughly 30 meters wide. Marcus was halfway down the bowl when the snow fractured above him. Evidence later found suggested he had attempted a sharp traverse to escape, but the speed of the slide caught him within seconds. He was swept nearly 200 feet downhill, partially buried beneath packed snow and ice shards. Remarkably, he wasn't unconscious. He'd landed twisted but face up, with only his lower body pinned beneath the snow. But what rescuers didn't anticipate, what no avalanche protocol had prepared for, was what came next. A grizzly bear arrived at the slide zone less than 15 minutes after the avalanche. Winter bear sightings in February were exceedingly rare, but the previous weeks of unseasonal warmth had disturbed several known dens in the area. Wildlife authorities later confirmed that this bear, likely a young adult male, had been roused early and seen scavenging down valley days earlier. Marcus, semi-exposed and barely mobile, would have been a source of movement and scent in the stark white silence. Tracks found at the scene showed that the bear had cautiously approached from the tree line, circled Marcus once, and lunged. The attack was short, but brutal. Claw marks tore across his upper thigh and back. He had defensive wounds on his forearms and a puncture just above the collarbone. According to rescuers, what saved him was likely his frantic movement, kicking and flailing despite his injuries, and his ski pole, which he had somehow gripped and jabbed toward the bear's snout during the encounter. The bear retreated after the initial attack, leaving behind shallow tracks and a spray of blood. By that point, Marcus was hypothermic and bleeding heavily, but conscious enough to trigger his emergency beacon. The signal was picked up by a SAR team based in Bozeman at approximately 4:10 p.m. It took nearly 2 hours for rescuers to reach the site by snowmobile and snowshoe. They arrived to find Marcus half buried, shaking uncontrollably, with one arm still loosely gripping the ski pole. His left leg was broken in 2 places, and he had deep gashes across his back and ribs. The scene bore the unmistakable signs of both a slide and a secondary wildlife encounter, a combination so rare that even veteran responders had never seen its like. He was airlifted to a hospital that evening and remained in critical care for 5 days. He could recount the events in fragments when he finally regained stable condition. He described the sound of the snow collapsing like a drum skin snapping. He remembered the pressure of snow on his chest, the impossible silence afterward, and the sound of claws on crusted snow. He never saw the bear's full face, only fur, breath, and weight. Once released to the public, the story spread quickly. Media outlets seized on the bizarre timing. A man who survived an avalanche only to be mauled by a grizzly minutes later. Experts from the Wildlife Agency spoke on the record about climate anomalies disturbing hibernation cycles. Dens that used to stay sealed until late March broke open midwinter, catching both animals and humans off guard. Several outdoor publications picked up Marcus's story, and survival experts praised his use of layered gear, the beacon, and his refusal to lose consciousness. His injuries required months of rehab, including 2 surgeries and partial nerve repair in his arm. He never returned to solo skiing, but he continued to hike and camp with a new level of caution. In later interviews, he explained that what haunted him wasn't the bear itself, but the chain of events. If the snow had held another 2 minutes, suppose he'd taken a different ridge, if the bear had still been sleeping. Every detail reminded him how survival sometimes comes down to a series of seconds. The Gallatin Avalanche Center issued a case study on the incident, titled "Buried Alive, Mauled Awake." It became required reading for backcountry safety courses in the region. The bear was never located. No tracking tags matched the prints found, and no further attacks occurred in that valley. Wildlife experts assumed it had returned to higher ground, still groggy and disoriented from its early rise. The bowl where it all happened was later nicknamed Halverson's Hollow by locals, not in mockery, but as a strange badge of respect. It remains closed during late winter to this day. In the summer of 2016, a wildlife film crew had set up base in the thick, unyielding brushlands of the Kronotsky Nature Reserve, located on Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula. Known for its geysers, active volcanoes, and a dense grizzly bear population, the reserve had long been off-limits to casual visitors. Only researchers, documentary teams, and tightly monitored eco-tourists were granted access. That year, a British-Russian production team had obtained rare permission to shoot a documentary titled Giants of the Valley, which focused exclusively on Kamchatka grizzlies' behavioral patterns. The crew operated under strict rules: no food left exposed, no travel alone, no filming within 200 meters of known bear trails. The Valley of Geysers, where they set up primary operations, was known for geothermal activity, and more relevantly, its proximity to seasonal salmon streams that lured dozens of bears yearly. Their strategy involved installing motion-triggered camera traps where the bears frequented most. That job fell to Pascal Erlenwein, a 34-year-old German field technician known among peers for his meticulous work and quiet temperament. Pascal had worked with wildlife teams in Namibia and Borneo, but admitted privately to a colleague that Russia's wilderness made him nervous. Still, he'd taken the job, armed with bear spray, a radio, and a lightweight climbing harness for setting cameras in elevated or otherwise risky locations. On August 14th, around 10:30 a.m. local time, Pascal radioed the crew that he was heading into a narrow, fern-choked valley 1.7 kilometers east of camp to install a high-sensitivity camera trap. It was marked on their map as Zone C7, noted for its dense foliage, uneven terrain, and bear movement. His last transmission was a brief check-in confirming he'd reached the site. No one panicked when he failed to respond to a status request 2 hours later. Radio interference was common in the valley. By mid-afternoon, the team grew uneasy. When calls to Pascal's radio remained unanswered by 4 o'clock p.m., the team initiated a field search. Initial efforts were slow, the terrain was hostile, and GPS coverage was spotty. By sunset, they had found only his empty gear crate and a disturbed patch of dirt where his tripod had been removed from its case. Nearby, flattened grass and clawed earth hinted at bear activity, but no sign of Pascal existed. The team launched a drone over the valley at dawn the following day. Roughly 400 meters from where his crate had been found, they spotted his backpack hanging from a low pine, bear spray canister clipped to its side. Below it, in a circular clearing, the drone captured footage of his hard hat cracked in two and fragments of his utility belt strewn about. When rangers arrived by midday, they followed a faint path into a nearby copse of trees. There they found Pascal's body. He had fallen nearly 8 meters from a birch tree. A forensic assessment later confirmed he had suffered a neck fracture and blunt trauma to the head consistent with a high fall. His bear spray had not been discharged. No teeth marks or mauling wounds were found. However, deep claw marks on the tree's bark and scuffed tracks around its base told a clearer story. Investigators concluded that Pascal had encountered a female grizzly with cubs, likely caught off guard while resting in the dense foliage. The bear had probably reacted defensively, charging him. Pascal had scrambled up the nearest tree in panic, a textbook response drilled into many wilderness workers. Unfortunately, in the chaos, he'd either slipped or the branch gave way beneath his weight. The bear had not followed him up, but had remained below for several minutes before wandering off, likely having seen no further threat. His radio had been smashed in the fall. The harness meant to secure him while climbing had remained in his pack. Whether due to haste or oversight, he'd gone up without anchoring himself. The film crew, shaken by the tragedy, suspended production for 2 weeks. Pascal's body was airlifted back to Petropavlovsk and later returned to his family in Stuttgart. The documentary was eventually completed, but the segment involving Zone C7 was never aired. Instead, a black title card appeared halfway through the film, dedicating the work to Pascal Erlenwein and mentioning only that he had died during production under unpredictable field conditions. His death sparked serious discussion in the professional wildlife filmmaking community. While most fatal encounters with grizzlies involved direct attacks, Pascal's case stood out because the bear had never touched him. He had done what he'd been trained to avoid confrontation, escape vertically, and remain calm. And still, it had ended in disaster. The event led several networks, including the European Wildlife Channel and Nature Focus TV, to revise their field safety protocols. Trees deemed climbable were now pre-checked for strength. Emergency beacons became standard issue. Solo trips into known bear corridors were heavily restricted or banned altogether. Among his peers, Pascal's story was repeated quietly in workshops and seminars, usually not with a tone of judgment, but as a sobering reminder of how quickly instincts and rules could be overtaken by real, raw panic. Bears, they would say afterward, are not villains. They are just animals acting in a world that's shrinking around them. Back in Kamchatka, the tree Pascal had climbed eventually split and fell in a storm the following spring. A returning crew nailed a small plaque to a nearby stump. Nothing official, just a few lines in Russian and German. He came to record nature. Nature recorded him instead. The valley grew quiet again. In April of 2011, a scientific expedition led by the Polar Institute embarked on a high-risk, multi-week research mission in the Arctic Ocean off the coast of Nord-Østlandet, part of the Svalbard archipelago in northern Norway. The team's objective was to study glacial melt and the behavior of ocean currents beneath large drifting ice flows. This task required direct observation and the deployment of underwater sensors in highly unstable terrain. Conditions were harsh. The region was experiencing record-breaking temperature shifts, with early seasonal melts making the ice thinner and more fragmented than in previous years. Researchers traveled by snowmobile and camped in temporary shelters on the ice. With them was 37-year-old glaciologist Dr. Leif Sorensen, a well-respected scientist known for his precise data collection and obsessive note-taking. He had been part of several previous expeditions and was admired by his peers for his calm under pressure and unusual ability to navigate complex, dangerous environments without panicking. The team operated in pairs for safety. However, on the morning of April 17th, a brief communication error and a fog bank rolling in from the west caused a momentary separation between Dr. Sorensen and his partner, marine biologist Tyrell Hovden. Sorensen had left the main cluster of tents to inspect a sensor malfunction roughly 200 meters away, near a fissure at the flow's edge. Tyrell had paused to reboot her radio system. By the time she looked up, the fog had swallowed him whole. According to the latter account, when he first sensed something was off, Sorensen had crouched near the ice's edge, examining a loose bracket on the sensor housing. At first, it was just the crunch of ice, a sound not unusual in that environment, but this was rhythmic and heavier. Then came the unmistakable shape cutting through the fog, a massive polar bear emerging like a ghost from the whiteness. There had been no warning, no growl, no posturing. The bear, likely an adult male displaced from its usual hunting grounds, had silently approached from a different flow, likely drawn by the unfamiliar scent of human sweat and gear. In recent years, due to retreating sea ice, such bears had been seen venturing far beyond their normal ranges, often desperate and aggressive. Dr. Sorensen, caught off guard, had little time to react. The bear charged across the ice, closing the distance in seconds. He had dropped his toolkit and attempted to run, but the uneven ice gave him little room. The bear's first swipe hit him across the back, sending him sprawling. Another blow struck his left arm, slicing through the heavy Arctic gloves and jacket, tearing deep into muscle and fracturing bone. He scrambled toward the nearest structure, an overturned sled positioned over a shallow trough in the ice. According to the field report compiled later, Sorensen had wedged beneath the sled just as the bear lunged again. The crude shelter provided limited protection, but was enough to interrupt the animal's attack. The bear clawed at the sled for several seconds, but the thick plastic and narrow opening worked to Sorensen's advantage. He remained curled in the cold shadow beneath it, bleeding, barely breathing. Back at the main encampment, the shouting had begun. Tyrell, hearing the distant crash and commotion, had alerted the rest of the team. Emergency flares were fired, and two members raced toward the last known coordinates. As they approached, the fog began to thin slightly. The bear, startled by the lights and noise, turned and disappeared into the whiteness as quickly as it had arrived. They found Sorensen conscious but pale, his face smeared with blood, his arm shredded. He'd slowed the bleeding with a makeshift tourniquet fashioned from his belt. He said only one thing: "Don't let the bear destroy the sensor array." He was medevaced by helicopter to the mainland and treated at a hospital in Tromsø, where surgeons worked for 9 hours to repair the torn tendons and crushed bone. He lost partial mobility in his left hand, but returned to research within the year, albeit now working mostly in coastal monitoring labs and delegating fieldwork to younger colleagues. The incident drew media attention, but Sorensen declined all interviews. The Polar Institute released a short statement confirming the attack and reiterating the dangers of Arctic fieldwork. Environmental groups used the event to highlight how melting sea ice forced polar bears into increasingly erratic and desperate behavior, leading to more human-bear encounters in previously deemed safe areas. Among his colleagues, Sorensen's survival became a quiet legend, not because he had fought off the bear or displayed any kind of dramatic heroism, but because of his presence of mind, sliding beneath that sled, enduring the pain, and staying alive long enough for help to arrive. The sensor he had gone to inspect was later found functioning perfectly. Years later, during a lecture on Arctic logistics at a university in Bergen, one of Sorensen's former teammates told a class of new researchers that the most important thing to bring on the ice wasn't a weapon or even a flare. It was something to hide under and the ability to stay still when everything in you wants to run. The dented and claw-marked sled, was eventually shipped back to the Institute. It now sits in a storage room near the Marine Lab, not labeled or displayed, but known among staff as Leif's Bunker. The team never returned to that specific flow. It drifted southward and eventually broke apart into the Greenland Sea. The bear was never seen again. In the remote interior of British Columbia, deep within the Caribou Mountains, a seasoned wilderness guide named Thaddeus Creek led a small party of American hunters on a week-long expedition in the autumn of 2007. The region, dense with black spruce, tamarack, and larch, was known for its unpredictable weather and sudden bear activity. Rugged and difficult to access, the area attracted only those with experience, or those who paid for someone else's. Creek, then 52, had been guiding for over 2 decades. A quiet man with a reputation for precision and stoic endurance, he knew the caribou backcountry as well as anyone could. Locals claimed he could read the wind like a map. With a scar from a moose antler across his chin and a limp from a snowmobile accident years back, he still moved with sharp purpose and rarely wasted words. On October 4th, a sudden storm rolled in late afternoon after 5 days in the bush with no major issues. Visibility dropped to a few feet, winds gusted up to 50 kilometers per hour, and the party was forced to halt on a high ridge near Pinecone Bluff. As the hunters regrouped, Creek offered to scout the nearest shelter site, a known hunting cabin less than a kilometer away through thick forest. He only carried his backpack, compass, flare gun, and hunting knife. He promised to return within the hour. He didn't. When the storm passed later that night and Creek hadn't returned, the remaining party, none experienced in solo navigation, was forced to radio for assistance. Search and rescue teams deployed at first light, and it took nearly 18 hours to locate his trail. Faint boot prints leading down a gully, washed over in several places by rainfall. What followed was pieced together from forensic evidence, bear tracking signs, and Creek's statements after his recovery. While descending into the forested basin below the ridge, Creek had been forced off his original path by falling debris and unstable ground. At some point in the detour, he stumbled into a thicket marked with overturned stumps, fresh claw marks, and the pungent odor of rot and meat. It was a grizzly's feeding ground, possibly a cache site, where a large male had stashed the remains of a recent kill. It was also a perfect example of how quickly an expert could fall out of sync with the wilderness. Creek later recalled that the signs were there: broken branches too fresh, a patch of earth dug out with unnatural symmetry. But he had been moving fast, focused on shelter, not reading the subtle language of the woods. He violated one of his long-standing principles: never push forward just to beat the weather. It was better to wait it out rather than stumble into something worse. The bear, likely bedded down nearby, charged before Creek could retreat. The first swipe broke his left shoulder, spinning him onto the forest floor. In later accounts, Creek said the only thought that crossed his mind was to make himself smaller, less of a threat. But the bear came at him again, with a deeper growl and a direct aim for his chest. Rolling behind a moss-covered log, Creek drew his hunting knife and thrust upward as the bear lunged over. He drove the blade deep into the bear's snout, more out of reflex than strategy. The animal recoiled, stunned by the pain. Blood sprayed across Creek's jacket, and the grizzly backed away, snorting and pawing the ground. It didn't flee, but it didn't finish the attack either. Perhaps the pain had confused it. Maybe the strike had made it hesitate. Whatever the reason, it turned and thundered back into the undergrowth, leaving Creek bleeding in the mud. What happened next was a grueling test of human grit against the raw cruelty of nature. Creek, delirious and injured, attempted to radio for help, only to realize his unit had been smashed in the fall. His compass was cracked, the needle stuck uselessly between west and northwest. Crawling became the only option. He moved in short bursts, sliding along the ground with his good arm while dragging his legs behind him, taking shallow breaths so the pain in his chest wouldn't overtake him. Hours passed like days. Every tree looked like a mirror of the last. He began to hallucinate. A fire pit, a familiar song, his old hunting dog trotting ahead of him on the trail. Badly wounded and miles from camp, Creek fashioned a crude sling for his shattered shoulder using his belt and jacket lining. He staggered downhill, disoriented and in shock, slipping in and out of consciousness. His only guiding hope was the sound of water. He knew the creek at the base of the valley eventually ran near the cabin he'd been trying to reach. It took him most of the night and the next day to crawl the remaining distance. Hypothermic, his face swollen, and unable to stand, he was found curled beneath a pile of wet fir boughs near the riverbank by a helicopter crew scanning infrared signatures. Medical staff at a regional hospital later described his injuries as devastating but survivable. The kind of trauma that would have killed someone slower to react or less determined to get out. Creek underwent 3 surgeries to reconstruct his shoulder and arm, followed by months of physical therapy. The knife, bent and blood-caked, was never recovered. It had likely come loose in the struggle and was buried beneath a mess of roots and leaves. He never blamed the bear. When local journalists asked him during his recovery if he'd ever return to the caribou, he said he would, but not without checking for claw marks first. The incident became well known among Canadian wilderness guides and sparked a revision in solo scouting protocols. Going forward, guides were required to carry satellite beacons even for short treks. Creek had always resisted them, calling them crutches for those who don't know how to read a ridge. After the attack, he changed his mind. By 2009, Creek was back to guiding, though he chose fishing trips over big game hunts. He no longer took clients deep into grizzly territory and quietly retired in 2014. Locals in Quesnel say he still walks the forest line in the evenings, checking for tracks and nodding to the trees like old friends. The hunters he'd left behind during the storm never forgot the man who tried to lead them to safety. One of them, a contractor from Minnesota named Joe Beardsley, later sent Creek a custom-engraved knife with a simple message etched on the blade: "For the log, not the bear." The scars healed mostly, but Creek kept the torn jacket, the one with bear blood and his own mixed in, as a reminder. Not of the attack, he said, but of how fast the wild reminds you whose house you're walking through.